Jonathan Roumie was being firmly escorted out of a Chicago restaurant by an irate manager who had no idea what she had just set in motion. The beloved actor, known for portraying Jesus in The Chosen, remained calm as she shouted at him to leave, while diners around them watched in stunned silence. What could he possibly have done to provoke such anger? Yet what happened next would completely upend her understanding of authority, control, and the unexpected power of grace. Within half an hour, the same manager would be on her knees, tears streaming, seeking forgiveness from the very man she had publicly humiliated. The change was so profound, so sudden, that it was captured on video and shared worldwide. This is the story of how one act of radical grace turned a moment of anger into an unforgettable lesson in compassion. 20 minutes earlier, Jonathan had simply entered Giovanni's, looking for a quiet meal after filming in downtown Chicago. The hostess, Maria, seated him next to an elderly man struggling to read the menu in the dim light. Without hesitation, Jonathan offered his help, sparking a warm conversation that brought joy to the man's face. But his simple act of kindness was being observed with growing irritation by someone who valued rules over compassion. Margaret Sullivan, the restaurant manager, prided herself on maintaining strict order and proper etiquette in her upscale establishment. From her post near the bar, she watched with mounting frustration as this unfamiliar customer engaged a stranger in conversation. She had worked too hard to build Giovanni's reputation to let some overly friendly patron turn it into a casual dining spot. Straightening her black blazer, she began walking toward the table with measured authority. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice controlled but tight with annoyance as she approached Jonathan. "Sir, I need to ask that you keep your conversations to your own table. This is a fine dining establishment, not a social club." Jonathan looked up, genuinely puzzled, his dark eyes meeting hers as he tried to understand. The elderly man beside him shifted uneasily. Around them, diners had gone quiet, sensing the tension building like storm clouds on a sunny day. Margaret's pale cheeks were flushed, the weight of her authority clear, unaware that this moment would linger in her memory for months. Jonathan responded softly, respectfully, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I was just helping this gentleman read the menu. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The elderly man, Frank, had been coming to Giovanni's every Friday for 2 years since his wife passed away, seeking comfort in the familiar routine and memories it evoked. His vision had been deteriorating due to macular degeneration, making simple tasks increasingly difficult, yet his pride had kept him from asking for help, until tonight. Jonathan's kindness brought him a rare warmth, a reminder that compassion still existed in a cold world. Now, seeing the young man being scolded, Frank felt a familiar ache of loneliness. His voice trembled as he spoke up, "Miss, this young man was just being helpful. There's no harm in that." Margaret's jaw tightened. She realized the situation was becoming more complicated, with other diners watching the exchange with growing interest. "Sir, I appreciate your input, but I must maintain certain standards in this establishment," she said, her tone sharpening as she felt her authority questioned. "Customers are expected to behave respectfully, ensuring they don't disturb others." Jonathan remained seated, hands folded calmly on the white tablecloth, but his expression had shifted, not to anger but to a quiet sadness, seeing how rules could outweigh human decency. The restaurant's warm lighting now seemed to cast shadows differently, highlighting the growing divide between those who understood grace and those who clung to strict protocol. Margaret felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her and, rather than yielding, doubled down, determined to assert her authority. What she didn't know was that Jonathan had spent the afternoon at a nearby nursing home, visiting residents who rarely receive visitors, sharing stories, and bringing smiles to faces accustomed to solitude. His heart was still full from those encounters, attuned to the loneliness often hidden behind polite society, making Frank's situation immediately recognizable to him. Reading a menu aloud was as natural as breathing, a small gesture that cost nothing but meant everything to someone struggling with fading sight. As he sat being lectured about propriety, Jonathan silently prayed for wisdom, asking God to guide his response with love instead of defensiveness. If you believe kindness should never be punished, comment, "I believe" below. His role as Jesus in The Chosen had taught him that the most profound moments often happen in unexpected places, and he sensed this was one of them. "I understand your concern," Jonathan said gently, rising from his chair with the calm grace that made him perfect for portraying Christ on screen. "But sometimes the most important thing we can do is help someone who is struggling. Isn't that what restaurants are really about? Bringing people together." His quiet authority made several nearby diners nod, while Margaret felt control slipping like sand through her fingers. The soft murmur of approval from other tables only strengthened her determination to reassert authority, even as a small voice inside her questioned whether she was handling things correctly. Frank looked up at Jonathan, tears forming in his eyes, recognizing something special in this stranger who stood for simple human kindness. The atmosphere shifted, transforming the restaurant from casual dining to a moment of reckoning. Margaret's face flushed deeper as she noticed other customers taking sides, and it wasn't going her way. "Sir, I'm not going to debate restaurant policy with you," she said, her voice rising slightly as her composure began to crack. "If you cannot follow our guidelines, perhaps this isn't the right establishment for you." Her threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable, while Jonathan remained calm despite the mounting hostility. Conversation stopped entirely as diners watched, some reaching for phones to record the tense standoff. The irony wasn't lost on Jonathan. He was being criticized for showing the compassion his most famous role had taught the world to value. Frank struggled to his feet, joints stiff with arthritis, and placed a protective hand on Jonathan's arm. "Young man, you don't need to fight my battles," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "But I want you to know that what you did tonight meant more to me than you'll ever understand." His words carried weight that settled over the room, creating a profound silence and making Margaret's rigid stance seem increasingly petty. Jonathan gently placed his hand over Frank's, a simple gesture of connection that spoke louder than words, stirring something in the hearts of the watching diners. This real-life drama was more compelling than any entertainment, a reminder of what truly matters in a world often obsessed with rules and appearances. Looking around, Jonathan saw faces reflecting his own childhood experiences of feeling different, judged before being understood. Growing up in a multicultural household with a Lebanese father and Irish mother, he had learned that grace often appears in the spaces between cultures, in moments when understanding transcends rules. His Catholic faith had deepened through years of playing Jesus, not because of the role itself, but because of the countless people who had shared their stories of loneliness and redemption with him. Now, facing a manager who valued protocol over compassion, he felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had guided him through difficult scenes. The restaurant's elegant decor seemed less important than the human connections being tested. Margaret sensed her control slipping as several customers whispered and exchanged pointed looks. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," she announced, her voice echoing across the dining room. "Your behavior is disruptive and I won't tolerate it any longer." The ultimatum drew audible gasps as diners processed what they were witnessing. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in prayer, asking for the strength to respond with grace in the face of injustice. When he opened them, his expression radiated peace, touching everyone who met his gaze. Maria, the young hostess, felt tears welling as she watched this kind stranger treated so unfairly. Raised in a family where hospitality was sacred, she was torn between her job and speaking up for what was right. Knowing her income was crucial for college, her conflict was visible across her face as she watched Jonathan gather his jacket with quiet dignity, never raising his voice or showing anger despite the public humiliation. His peaceful response reminded her of stories her grandmother had told about saints facing persecution with grace. As Jonathan prepared to leave, he turned to Frank one last time, his voice gentle yet audible to nearby tables. "Mr. Frank, it's an honor to meet you tonight. Would you mind if I said a quick prayer for your meal?" The request was so unexpected and beautifully simple that it stopped Margaret mid-stride as she moved to escort him out. Frank's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile he'd worn in weeks, nodding eagerly, grateful for this small blessing on what had started as just another lonely dinner. The restaurant seemed to pause as Jonathan bowed his head, offering a quiet prayer of gratitude, for food, for friendship, and for the opportunity to serve others even in difficult circumstances. His words carried a reverence that transformed the tense atmosphere into something nearly sacred, leaving many diners unexpectedly moved by the sincerity of his faith. Margaret stood frozen, witnessing genuine spirituality in her carefully controlled space, feeling a crack in her professional armor. The prayer was neither performative nor showy, it was heartfelt gratitude, a reminder of humanity, grace, and connection. As Jonathan finished and gently squeezed Frank's shoulder, several other customers had tears in their eyes, touched by authentic faith in action. Margaret felt a stirring in her chest, a longing she hadn't experienced since childhood when her grandmother taught her to pray before meals. Yet pride and professional identity kept her locked in her stance, unable to back down even as her heart softened. A middle-aged woman dining alone suddenly stood and applauded. "That was beautiful," she called out. "In a world full of selfishness, it's refreshing to see someone who cares about others." Her words sparked a chain reaction. Other diners nodded and murmured their agreement, creating growing support for Jonathan, making Margaret's authority increasingly tenuous. At table 12, a businessman left twice his usual tip, telling his server he'd been inspired by what he'd witnessed. A young couple near the window exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing they had just witnessed something rare and precious in a world often cold and disconnected. Jonathan gathered his belongings with the same quiet grace he had shown throughout the ordeal, never once speaking harshly to Margaret or diminishing her authority. As he walked toward the door, he paused at several tables, offering gentle words of encouragement to diners moved by the scene. His presence seemed to leave a trail of warmth, as if his brief time in the restaurant had planted seeds of kindness that were already beginning to grow. Margaret watched from behind the bar, hands gripping the polished wood, trying to process the emotions swirling inside her. The restaurant that had felt like her kingdom minutes ago now seemed like a prison of her own making, filled with customers who looked at her with disappointment instead of respect. Outside, Jonathan stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the cool Chicago air, feeling the familiar weight of carrying others' pain. His years portraying Jesus had taught him that being faithful sometimes meant accepting rejection and misunderstanding, but it never got easier to watch fear and pride triumph over love and compassion. The city lights twinkled around him like earthly stars, reminding him that even in darkness, light exists for those willing to seek it. He pulled out his phone to call an Uber, but before dialing he heard the restaurant door chime. Turning, he saw a figure approaching through the warm glow spilling from Giovanni's windows, and his heart prepared for whatever conversation God might be orchestrating next. Maria had clocked out early, unable to concentrate after witnessing the evening's events, and rushed outside to catch him before he disappeared into the Chicago night. "Please wait," she called softly, her voice carrying urgency and reverence. Jonathan turned, interest piqued. "I know this might sound strange, but I recognized you from The Chosen. You're Jonathan Roumie, aren't you?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with the realization that the kind stranger kicked out of the restaurant was the actor who brought Jesus to life for millions worldwide. Jonathan nodded gently, humble and slightly embarrassed, as if being recognized in this moment felt almost inappropriate given the circumstances. The irony settled over both of them. The man who portrayed the Prince of Peace had just been rejected for showing the very compassion his character embodied. Maria's eyes filled with tears as the full weight of the moment sank in. The synchronicity of meeting the actor who had strengthened her faith just as she questioned whether kindness had any place in the working world. "You probably don't remember, but I wrote you a letter last year after watching season 2, she said, voice trembling. "I told you how the show helped me through my parents' divorce, how watching Jesus love people gave me hope that I could learn to forgive." Jonathan's face lit up with recognition and warmth as he remembered the handwritten letter from a Chicago college student who had shared her struggles with maintaining faith during family turmoil. The connection between them deepened as they realized this encounter was not coincidental but providential, a moment orchestrated by the same divine hand that had guided their previous correspondence. The bustling city street around them seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet glow of God's perfect timing. "Maria," Jonathan said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had captivated audiences worldwide. "I remember your letter perfectly. You said you were studying to become a social worker to help families stay together." The fact that he remembered such a specific detail among thousands of letters made Maria's heart race with gratitude and amazement. Standing on the Chicago sidewalk, she felt like she was living inside a gospel story, where ordinary moments became extraordinary through divine intervention. Jonathan's eyes sparkled with the same warmth she had seen on screen, but experiencing it in person felt like being touched by grace itself. The traffic and distant conversations faded into background noise. The space between them felt sacred, removed from the ordinary world rushing by. "What happened in there tonight?" Maria asked, gesturing toward the restaurant where warm light still spilled through the windows. "It wasn't right. You were just being kind, just like Jesus would have been." Her words carried conviction, recognizing the character she had admired on screen living out that same love in real life. Jonathan's humility in the face of praise reminded her of gospel accounts of Christ deflecting glory, always pointing toward the Father rather than accepting honor himself. A stirring rose in Maria's spirit, a sense that this moment was more than a chance encounter between an actor and a fan. Something important was beginning on this busy Chicago street, though neither of them could yet see the full picture of God's orchestration. Meanwhile, back inside Giovanni's, Frank sat staring at his untouched meal. His appetite had vanished after witnessing unnecessary cruelty toward a stranger who had shown him kindness. Other diners had resumed conversation, but the atmosphere remained heavy, filled with unspoken questions about what they'd witnessed and their own hesitations to act. Margaret moved mechanically behind the bar, replaying the evening's events with unease. The restaurant's usual Friday night energy felt hollow, everyone going through the motions while processing what had touched them more deeply than expected. Several customers asked for their checks early, the promise of fine dining overshadowed by the bitter taste of injustice they had seen. A distinguished older gentleman at table 8, Dr. William Patterson, a retired theology professor from Northwestern University, had been watching the scene with growing concern. He recognized something familiar in Jonathan's response to persecution, the same grace under fire he had spent decades teaching students to recognize in biblical accounts of Jesus facing accusers. His mind raced with theological implications while his heart ached for both the kind stranger and the manager trapped by rigid thinking. David, the young server attending Frank's table, approached with gentle concern. "Sir, is everything all right with your meal? You haven't touched anything." His voice trailed off, not wanting to bring up the uncomfortable scene. Frank looked up, decades of wisdom and fresh pain in his eyes. "Son, the food is fine. It's my appetite that's gone. That young man showed me more kindness in 5 minutes than I've had in months, and he got punished for it." David nodded, feeling guilty for staying silent but understanding the courage it took to intervene. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant manager monitoring social media. "Boss, we have a problem. Someone filmed tonight's incident, and it's already going viral on Twitter. #Giovanni's fail is trending." The message hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained reputation for running a classy establishment was crumbling in real time, transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing rules over human decency. Outside, Jonathan and Maria's conversation was interrupted by Dr. Patterson, who had paid his check and stepped outside with the stride of a man on a mission. "Excuse me," he said, voice carrying authority. "I witnessed what happened in there tonight. Your response was a perfect example of the grace we claim to believe in but rarely practice." His words carried weight, coming from someone who had spent his career studying religious behavior, making his observation an official validation of Jonathan's character. Maria looked between the two men in amazement, realizing God was assembling witnesses to this moment, people who understood the significance of what they had experienced. The three stood in a small circle on the busy sidewalk, forming an impromptu sanctuary amid the chaos. "I'm Dr. William Patterson," he continued, extending his hand to Jonathan. "I taught theology at Northwestern for 35 years, and I've never seen such a clear demonstration of Christ-like behavior outside of a church." His credentials added weight, transforming his statement from opinion to expert testimony on the spiritual significance of the evening. Jonathan accepted the handshake with humility, uncomfortable with praise but recognizing the professor's sincere heart. Maria felt goosebumps, witnessing a divine appointment unfold as three strangers were connected by something far deeper than circumstance. Streetlights cast their small gathering in a warm glow, separating them from the bustling city. Dr. Patterson's eyes burned with the passion of a teacher who had found the perfect illustration for a lifelong lesson. "Young man, what you did tonight, showing kindness to a stranger, maintaining dignity under attack, blessing your persecutor, these aren't just gestures. They're radical acts of love that turn the world upside down." His words carried theological weight, framing the evening's events in a larger narrative of faith challenging worldly power. Jonathan listened with respectful attention, while Maria felt her own understanding of grace deepen. The professor's insight revealed that what seemed a simple act of kindness was part of a much larger story, how grace operates in a broken world. As the three of them talked, Frank appeared in the restaurant doorway, moving slowly but with steady determination toward the small group gathered on the sidewalk. "I hope you don't mind an old man joining this conversation," he said, his voice stronger than it had been inside. "But I couldn't let you leave without saying what needs to be said." His presence completed the gathering of witnesses who had recognized the sacred nature of the evening's events. Jonathan's face lit up with genuine joy at seeing Frank again, while Maria and Dr. Patterson welcomed him with the reverence due to someone at the center of the transformative moment. The four now stood together, united by their shared experience of witnessing authentic grace under pressure, and by the sense that God had orchestrated this encounter for purposes larger than any of them could fully comprehend. Frank's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small worn leather wallet. "Son, I want you to have something," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he unfolded a creased photograph. "This is my Mary, my wife of 52 years. She taught me that kindness is never wasted, even when the world doesn't recognize it. The photo showed a gentle-faced woman with warm eyes and a radiant smile, someone who instinctively understood the value of treating every person with dignity. Jonathan accepted the photograph with reverence, aware he was being entrusted with something precious, a symbol of a love that had shaped Frank's understanding of human decency. The gesture moved both Maria and Dr. Patterson to tears, recognizing the significance of an elderly widower sharing his most treasured possession with a stranger who had shown simple kindness. Mary always said that Jesus shows up in the most unexpected places, through the most unlikely people, Frank continued, his voice growing stronger. Tonight you showed up for me when I needed it most. And that manager showed me exactly what Mary warned against, letting rules become more important than people. His words carried the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to distinguish between religion and relationship, protocol and purpose. The small group stood in reverent silence, processing the weight of Frank's testimony and how beautifully it connected their experiences into something larger and more meaningful. As cars passed and the city pulsed around them, they had created a pocket of peace where truth could be spoken and grace recognized. Inside, Margaret's world was collapsing. Social media had erupted, thousands sharing outrage over the treatment of the kind stranger who had been removed for showing compassion. The restaurant phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters, bloggers and angry patrons threatening boycotts unless she issued a public apology. Staff moved around her with uneasy glances, unsure how to navigate a crisis born from what had seemed a simple management decision. The elegant dining room, once her pride, now felt like a tomb filled with the echo of mistakes and the weight of unforeseen consequences. Margaret realized some decisions could not be undone, only learned from. The restaurant door chimed again and she looked up to see an impossible sight. The man she had expelled was returning, leading Frank, Maria, Dr. Patterson and several other customers back inside. Jonathan's face showed no anger, only the same calm expression he had maintained all evening. The dining room fell silent as word spread that the evening's central figure had returned, and anticipation hung in the air like electricity. Margaret's heart raced as she realized this moment might redefine not just her evening but her understanding of leading with grace rather than authority. Jonathan approached the bar where she stood, speaking in the same gentle tone he had used during their earlier confrontation. "Ma'am, I came back because I realized something important. This isn't really about me or even Mr. Frank. It's about what kind of world we want to create together." His words carried no condemnation, no "I told you so," only an invitation to see the events through a different lens. The crowd held its collective breath, unsure if forgiveness or confrontation would follow. Margaret felt a crack open inside her chest, a door long locked behind professional protocol and pride. Maria, tears streaming, recognized the same radical grace she had seen portrayed on screen, now manifesting in real life. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered. "You came back after what I did?" Jonathan's eyes remained kind as he nodded. "I came back because someone once told me that grace means showing up for people, especially when they don't deserve it. And because I think there might be more to your story than tonight." His words landed like seeds in Margaret's heart, beginning to take root where years of defensiveness and rigid thinking had hardened the soil. Frank stepped forward, his face shining with an inner light. "Miss Margaret, this young man reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten since Mary passed. Love always finds a way to circle back, even when we think all doors are closed." His words carried the authority of someone who had lived through enough loss to recognize grace, making it impossible for Margaret to dismiss them. The elderly man's forgiveness washed over Margaret, leaving her struggling to breathe normally. Dr. Patterson, nodding in approval, recognized the transformative encounter he had spent decades trying to illustrate through scripture. Margaret's defenses finally crumbled, revealing the scared little girl who had learned to protect herself by controlling every situation. "I was so wrong," she sobbed. "I turned kindness into a crime and made this beautiful place feel cold and cruel." Her confession echoed through the restaurant like a bell, while the gathered witnesses understood they were witnessing something sacred. Jonathan stepped closer, not to lecture, but to offer the comfort he had shown Frank, recognizing Margaret's breakdown as the start of something beautiful. Unexpectedly, Margaret fell to her knees, not in defeat but in surrender. "Jesus," she whispered, "I've been so wrong about everything, about people, power and what really matters." Her transformation was visible, like ice melting in spring. The restaurant fell silent, except for the quiet sound of grace at work, opening hearts locked by pride. As Margaret rose, supported by Jonathan's gentle hand, the restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause, celebrating grace more than the moment itself. I need to make this right, she said, voice shaky but determined. Not just with you but with everyone who works here, everyone who comes here. Jonathan nodded, seeing authentic repentance that leads to real change. Staff emerged from the kitchen, amazed at their demanding boss's humility. Frank approached with the slow dignity of someone who understood forgiveness. My dear, you've just learned what Mary taught me for 52 years. Being wrong is only the first step toward being right. Margaret reached for his hand, trembling, whispering, I'm so sorry. You deserved kindness, not coldness, especially in your loneliness. Frank smiled, understanding her apology came from a genuinely transformed heart. Their embrace became a picture of grace itself, the wounded and the wounder finding healing together. Dr. Patterson, his mind spinning with theological implications, offered his perspective. What we've witnessed tonight is nothing short of miraculous, not flashy but quiet, changing hearts and communities one person at a time. Maria wiped tears as she watched the restaurant transform from cold and rule-driven into warm and welcoming. Other customers shared quiet reflections, inspired to examine their own responses to strangers in need. In the weeks that followed, Giovanni's became known not for fine dining but for the radical kindness born that Friday night. Margaret instituted a policy hosting free Friday dinners for seniors, with staff encouraged to sit and talk with lonely guests. Frank became a regular, serving as an unofficial greeter. Maria was promoted to assistant manager, her compassion now recognized alongside her organizational skills. Dr. Patterson began holding informal theological discussions in the private dining room, using the night's events as a case study in practical Christianity. Jonathan continued his work, but the story of that evening followed him everywhere, inspiring strangers to show kindness, creating ripples of compassion far beyond a single restaurant. Margaret kept Frank's photo on her desk as a reminder that every person carries a story deserving respect. A simple act, reading a menu to an elderly gentleman, had become a catalyst for transformation, proving that God can use the smallest gestures to achieve the greatest change. The lesson echoes through time. When we choose protocol over people, we miss sacred opportunities to be vessels of grace in a world starving for genuine kindness. Jonathan showed that true strength isn't demanding respect. It's offering love when love isn't returned. The question remains, when faced with a choice between holding your position or extending your hand, which will you choose? Will you build walls or bridges? If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of faith transforming lives and share in the comments. Have you witnessed grace change someone's heart? The world is watching, and eternity hangs in the balance of these everyday sacred decisions.